Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending and participating in tonight's events. My name is Sarah Hargreaves. I'm the president of the Kansas City Atheist Coalition, and we are extremely pleased and proud to be co-sponsoring tonight's debate with the School of Faith. The title of tonight's debate is Same-Sex Marriage, Pro or Con. Dr. John Corvino will be speaking on behalf of the affirmative. John Mark Miravalle will be presenting tonight's negative arguments. And JT Eberhard is tonight's moderator. Many of you know JT as the co-founder of Skepticon in Springfield, Missouri, and the popular blogger at What Would JT Do? Until recently, JT was also the high school coordinator for the Secular Student Alliance and built their high school program. JT is also a genuinely nice person. So without further ado, I will turn tonight's debate over to JT.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a lovely intro, despite breaking the 9th commandment with that last nice guy jab. I would say welcome to the Rumble and whatever, but these are genuinely two of the nicest people I've ever met in this biz. The first one is John Mark, not John Henry, Miravalle. He teaches theology and philosophy at the School of Faith at the St. Lawrence Center. He wrote The Drug, the Soul, and God, available at fine bookstores everywhere and Amazon. He has published articles in The Thomist, the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars Quarterly, and Homiletic and Pastoral Review. He also helped me pronounce that word right before I ever got up here. And he lives in Lawrence with his wife, Jessica, and 3 kids. Ladies and gentlemen, John Mark Miravalle. On the other side is Dr. John Corvino. He's the chair of philosophy at Wayne State University. He's the co-author of Debating Same-Sex Marriage, which is available for purchase and signing afterwards, just right outside those doors. He's also produced a number of videos on the same-sex arguments, which can be found on YouTube as well as at johncorvino.com. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. John Corvino. And I stuttered before I got up here. I asked if either of them wanted to be called doctor, and they both said no, and I've done John Corvino, a great disservice by failing. The format for the debate is each will have a 20-minute opening followed by a 10-minute rebuttal. I would ask that everybody hold their jeers and their applause until after the speaker gets done. So after the 20-minute opening, you may jeer or applaud, ditto after the 10-minute rebuttal. For the question and answer session, after the rebuttal segment, there'll be a small break for audio-visual tweaking. During that time, I'll put out 2 boxes for which you can write down questions on your pen and paper, and I'll tell you which speaker has either box. So at that time, you'll be able to submit your questions, so just write them out throughout the course of the event. And without further ado, I will get out of the way and let John Corvino take the mic first. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, JT. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. And before we begin, I want to do like the presidential candidates do and lower your expectations. Because my opponent, John Mark Miravalle, is going to say that he's at a real disadvantage here because this happens in conjunction with the Kansas City Atheist Meet, and also because I've written a book on same-sex marriage. I've written many articles for the last 8 or 9 years or so. I've debated many people on this issue, whereas he has not really focused on this issue. But you realize there's a flip side to that, which is that for the last several weeks, he has been able to pour through a treasure trove of things I've said and maybe shouldn't have said, whereas I've absolutely been able to find nothing at all that he's written on this subject. And between the time that he gives his opening statement and I give my rebuttal to that opening statement, I'll have about 5 seconds in which to organize my thoughts. So have I lowered your expectations sufficiently? Don't expect much from me tonight. I'm actually really pleased to be here with John Mark. We went to dinner before this event, and we've corresponded a bit by email and talked on the phone. And it's funny because, as I've been doing this for years, and I did the book with Maggie Gallagher, people have often asked me, how is it that you, as a gay man and a gay rights advocate, can sort of hang around and be friendly with people who are opposed to your marriage rights? And the answer to that question is very simple. I drink. A lot. You have no idea. No, the answer to that question is complex, but a big part of it is that I understand that we all have to share the world together. And the more we can sort of listen to each other and understand each other and have a thoughtful dialogue with each other, the better equipped we are to do that. And I think tonight is a really nice opportunity for us to do that. And I'm really glad to be doing that with John Mark Miravalle. As we think about this issue, there are 3 key points that I like to keep in mind. Relationships are good for people. Marriage is good for relationships. And some of our fellow citizens are gay or lesbian. Now, I want to say a little bit about each of those and elaborate somewhat. First, relationships are good for people. Yes, they make us happy, and many of us aspire to happily ever after, but there's more to it than just a happy feeling. Having someone to come home to at night, to wake up with in the morning, to share life's joys and sorrows with, this is a beautiful part of the human experience. Having someone to take care of, and vice versa. At its best, this can actually help make us better people, get us outside of ourselves. And there's enough of that kind of love and commitment to go around. Marriage is good for relationships. Why? Well, that kind of commitment I was just talking about can be challenging over the long haul. And what marriage does is it helps us in many ways to meet that challenge. One way it does this is legally, by establishing the couple as family in the eyes of the law. So that, for example, if one person gets sick, the other person can visit that person in the hospital or make decisions in the event of incapacity. If one person dies, the other person can get bereavement leave. If one person is the breadwinner, the other person has access to Social Security benefits. If one person is a foreigner, the other person can help get residency status for that person. May not seem like a big deal to you unless you happen to fall in love with someone who's not an American citizen. If one person gets into legal trouble, the other person cannot be forced to testify against that person. May not seem like a big deal to you unless you happen to be dating a criminal. But what this does is it creates a zone of privacy around the couple that can be important. And if the couple breaks up, as couples sometimes do, there's a set of laws in place to help that go more smoothly. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And people don't often realize that one important reason for same-sex marriage is same-sex divorce. That for most of us, there are no laws in place to figure out how to untangle that which has been melded together in this way. But of course, marriage is not just about a set of legal rights and responsibilities. It's also about social support. When you stand in front of your family and friends and pledge to love, honor, and cherish, and your family and friends hold you to that, there's something very valuable about that in terms of helping to sustain the relationship through for better and especially through for worse. And it's important to recognize that this kind of long-term care, having someone whose job it is to take care of you and vice versa, is not just good for the two of you. It's also good for the people around you. Why? Because happy, stable couples make for happy, stable neighbors. Which brings me to that third point about some of our fellow citizens are gay or lesbian. In terms of what we want for our society, when the people next door are gay or lesbian, what would be in society's interest? That they be alone? That they do their thing but they're on their own? Or that they have the kinds of support, the same rights and responsibilities as other people? My view is that this is a kind of win-win. It's good for the couple, but it's also good for society at large, because society has an interest in promoting happy, stable relationships for as many people as want those. So, given all of that, why the opposition to same-sex marriage? Well, we're going to hear some arguments from John Mark in a little bit, and I'm looking forward to those. I really have no idea what he's going to say. It's kind of exciting. But I want to talk about some of the things that I do sometimes here, and one of them has to do with religion. People say, well, my religion says that this is wrong. And I want to make clear that what I'm talking about tonight is same-sex civil marriage, something that the state does, which is different from religious marriage, something that your church or other religious institution does. Now, in the United States, people sometimes have a hard time separating these things in their minds, in part because we use the same word, marriage, for both of those. And typically, if people want both, they do them at the same time. They fill out the relevant paperwork in City Hall, and they go to their minister, and as long as they file the paperwork afterwards, they are married both in the eyes of the state and in the eyes of that religious institution. Not every country does it this way. My in-laws actually had two weddings in the Philippines, one in a Catholic church and one a month later in a courthouse. I want to make clear that whatever the state does regarding marriage, it cannot force your religious institution to perform any ceremony it does not want to perform, any more than it can force it to perform baptisms it doesn't want to perform, or bar mitzvahs that it doesn't want to perform, or so on. This is a civil issue, not a religious issue. So what else do people say that's not based specifically in a religious tradition, especially as if we embrace a society, we embrace freedom of religion. We want people who practice different faiths and for people who practice no faith at all to be able to experience marriage. What are some of the arguments there? Well, some people say that this is a threat somehow to traditional marriage. I'll be honest, I've been doing this for a long time. I don't quite get that argument. I mean, do people think that if we support same-sex couples in their relationships, straight people will stop having straight relationships and all go gay? The usual response to a gay person is not, hey, no fair. How come he gets to be gay? Do we think that if we support same-sex marriage, heterosexual people will give up on the institution of marriage? What's that dinner conversation going to look like? Well, Jane, I wanted to marry you, but now the guys next door are getting married, so forget it. No, we can support traditional heterosexual marriage while recognizing that it's not right for everyone, and we don't do anybody any favors by pressuring them into situations that they're not suited for. Don't do gay people any favors, don't do the people they marry or their families any favors. Well, some people say, well, if we allow same-sex marriage, why not polygamy? Why not incest? Why not bestiality? There's this whole sort of slippery slope argument. And again, I find this argument somewhat perplexing. I don't know what one thing has to do with the other. I mean, polygamy can be heterosexual or homosexual, and in fact, the societies that tend to practice it are among the least accepting of same-sex relationships. Incest can be heterosexual or homosexual. Bestiality, I suppose, can be heterosexual or homosexual. I prefer not to think about it that carefully. So what does one thing have to do with the other? And people say, well, if you make one change to marriage, why not make any other change? To which my response is, because each one has to be evaluated on its own merits. Whether it's a good idea to allow people to marry one unrelated person of the same sex is a different question from whether it's a good idea for them to marry multiple partners or their relatives or their pets and so on. And frankly, I think the people who bring up this argument are, in a way, changing the subject. Some people think that same-sex marriage would somehow be bad for children. This is a fairly serious charge, because if you want to smear a group of people, one of the worst things you can say is that they're harming your children. So it's important to be clear on what we mean by this. And in my discussions with Maggie Gallagher in the book we did together, she makes a version of this argument based on the idea that children need a mother and father, and so we should therefore not allow same-sex couples to marry. Now, I think that this is actually the worst kind of argument. It proceeds from what is not true to what does not follow. In the terms of what is not true, children need a mother and father. Well, of course, we all know that there are children who do well in single-parent households, and mother, father, two mothers, two fathers. The data on that seems pretty clear. So then people say, no, the ideal situation, the best, the optimal situation for children is with their own mother and father. Now, if you go to the mainstream health and welfare organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychological Association, the Child Welfare League of America, the National Association of Social Workers, all of them have in fact denied this. They say when you compare apples to apples and you control for other variables, children raised by same-sex parents do just as well as children raised by different-sex parents. I'd be happy to quote some of those for you. So I don't want to play the game of my sources can beat up your sources, but if we look at mainstream science, it just doesn't support that premise. But let's suppose you still want to say, no, but that's the best situation for children, their own mother and father, regardless of what the American Academy of Pediatrics says. The conclusion about marriage still does not follow, because same-sex marriage never takes children away from competent mothers and fathers who want them. I'm going to say this again. Same-sex marriage never takes children away from competent mothers and fathers who want them. It's not as if same-sex couples, by getting married, have license to kidnap children from their own biological families. That's not what marriage does. And preventing same-sex marriage does not cause lesbians to go marry their sperm donors and form traditional families. What it does do is it provides support and stability to the many children, about 250,000 in this country alone, who are currently being raised by same-sex couples. So if our concern here is really children's welfare, it is not at all clear how preventing same-sex marriage is going to cause more children to have mothers and fathers. But it is clear how it's going to make life more difficult for those children. Now, there are many people who don't think that this debate really has to do with empirical data like that at all. That it really has to do with what we might refer to as the natural complementarity of the sexes, the idea that men and women go together in this special way. When I think about the complementarity argument, one of the things I think about is the fact that people complement each other, they complete each other in different ways. I think about my friend Bob and his partner Larry. Bob can be kind of moody and cranky sometimes. Larry is more even-keeled. Bob is kind of cerebral. Larry is more affective and emotional. They complement each other and are good for each other, and frankly good for the people around them, because Bob is a little bit less moody because he has Larry in his life. But some people want to say, but they still can't achieve the true complementarity of male and female. And I say, why? And they say, it's very simple. It boils down to basic plumbing. And I say, plumbing? Yes, plumbing. The parts don't fit. And when people tell me that the parts don't fit, I have a very simple response. Yes, they do. Because if they didn't, people would try it, it wouldn't work, and they'd go do something else. I mean, I've actually had people say, well, of course same-sex marriage is wrong because... And I want to say, if you're doing it this way, you're doing it wrong. What do you want me to tell you? Gay people are not stupid. Oh my God, the parts don't fit. What are we going to do? You start to understand why these discussions always focus on male homosexuality, because what does lesbianism look like to these people? It's like... But there's a more serious response to this argument, which is that it's a powerful example of how in this debate, gay and lesbian people's lives and love and relationships and families get reduced to parts, to this, and how we miss the larger picture of why this is significant to people, why it's important to have someone to have and to hold, for better, for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do they part. And that's true for straight people, and it's true for gay people as well. And I welcome this opportunity to have a more thoughtful dialogue with John Mark and all of you. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? You know, he said that somehow I've got the advantage. Who would you want to be? The guy debating the guy who wrote the book, debating same-sex marriage? You know, let's... So, like a lot of the folks John debates, I'm a Catholic, and I always get a kick out of seeing how other people view the Catholic Church, especially its sexual teachings. I like the Onion comedy news station, and they ran a headline a while back, and it said, "The Vatican condemns spooning." So apparently there's that last frontier of intimacy gone now too. But they ran another headline that said, "Pope reverses Catholic ban on same-sex marriage after he meets a charming gay couple from Connecticut." And the idea there, right, is that people oppose same-sex marriage because they don't realize what good, decent people those who self-identify as gay can be. Well, I just want to start by saying for the record, if that were the case, my thinking on this issue would surely have been changed by meeting John Corvino. He's an exceptionally gracious guy, been very nice, great guy. But for me, the question tonight isn't whether I like gay people, whether I think they're good, decent people. Of course I do. The question is whether I think same-sex marriage is a good thing, and I think it isn't. And the reason I think it isn't is because I think homosexual activity isn't a good thing. So I'm going to try to argue both those points and show the connection between them. But before I do that, I want to cite something John wrote in his book, which I think is enormously helpful in this discussion. John wrote that we all have moral blind spots. And that's true, and that's important for everyone to remember. It's important for me to remember. I have moral blind spots. I'm sure my wife could talk for hours about my moral blind spots. In fact, she's right there. You can see her nodding. And what's a little alarming is a lot of you are suddenly nodding, like you can see my moral blind spots from where you're sitting. I don't know how that's possible. But the point is, my wife loves me, even though she recognizes my moral blind spots, even though she sometimes points them out to me. So that's all I'm trying to do tonight. I'm trying to point out some of the moral blind spots that I think proponents of same-sex marriage are prone to overlooking. Okay, so why don't I think homosexuality is a good thing, homosexual activity? Well, first off, I think sex is supposed to be about love. And I think love, in any profound sense, is about give and take. Right? In any deep, profound, loving relationship, we say that there's some real meaningful giving there. And we use the word complementarity, which John brought up, to describe the context in which it's possible to meaningfully give to someone. But that brings us to a very important principle. And the principle is that a gift loses its meaning when it's already possessed by the recipient. A gift isn't meaningful if the one you're giving it to already has it. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, a movie came out. I loved the movie, thought it was a great movie, told everyone about it. So funny, so well made. So when my birthday rolled around, I got 2 copies of that same DVD as a present. Now, the person who gave me that second copy surely meant well. I appreciated his intentions, but the gift was not of much value to me. I already had 1 copy. I don't need 2 copies of the exact same DVD. I only have 1 DVD player. There was nothing else I could do with the second one. So it was redundant. It was superfluous. It didn't have meaning as a gift, even though, again, I appreciated the good intentions behind it. All right, now apply that to relationships. I have a lot of male friends. We are complementary on a lot of different levels. Maybe in terms of personality, in terms of sense of humor, in terms of our interests, in terms of our temperament. Kind of like Bob and Larry, maybe. And so we can give and take from each other on all those different levels. But we can't give to each other when we both possess the same thing. It doesn't work. I can't give a friend the knowledge that he already has. If I tried to give him knowledge he already has, if I tried to tell him something he already knows, he'd say, yeah, man, I already know. I can't give him a conviction he already has. If I tried to make him feel indignant about something he already feels indignant about, if I tried to give him a conviction he already has, he'd say, dude, you're preaching to the choir. Wouldn't be meaningful. And by the same token, I can't give a friend the sex that he already has. I can't give him the wealth of what it is to be a man, the richness of my masculinity, of my sexual status. I can't give him that if he already has it. And that's what sex is about. It's about giving yourself as a man or as a woman, giving the richness of your sex, which is why we call it sex. But if the other person already has that richness, if the other person already is a man, well, it's not a meaningful gift. So, I agree with John in the sense that I think 2 men can be complementary in a lot of different ways. 2 men, for instance, can be complementary personally. Because when you're dealing with 2 men, you're dealing with 2 different persons. 2 men can even be complementary physically. The way, for instance, a small point guard and a large center are physically complementary on a basketball team. Because when you're dealing with 2 men, you're dealing with 2 different bodies. But I don't see how it's possible for 2 men to be sexually complementary Because when you're dealing with two men, you're not dealing with two different sexes, you're dealing with the same sex. How can there be complementarity there? But if there's not sexual complementarity, that means there can't be sexual give and take on a meaningful level. And if there's not sexual give and take on a meaningful level, that means there can't be sexual love, even though there can be a lot of other forms of love. There can't be sexual love. So to use a gesture of sexual love in a way that's not sexually loving seems to me to misunderstand and misuse sex. Again, what sex is about is uniting not just two bodies, not just two persons, but two sexes, which is why we call it sex in the first place. And I think this inability to give meaningfully on the sexual level between two men or two women becomes especially pronounced and vivid when you talk about fertility. I think fertility is part of the gift that you give in the sexual act. And obviously that can't be present between two men and two women. That's not homosexual behavior, activity is not fertile. Now, someone could reject my premise and say, well, I disagree with you. I don't think sex has anything to do with fertility. I think that's pretty obviously untrue, right? Just to start with, our sexual organs we also call our genitals. We also call our reproductive organs. Why? Because they're for generation. They're for reproduction. Now, John and a lot of other folks have done a great job of pointing out that a body part can have two functions, and it doesn't mean you're required to engage in all those functions at the same time. The mouth is for eating. It's also for talking. You don't have to eat every time you talk. You don't have to talk every time you eat. But I think the connection between sex and fertility goes a lot deeper than just a body part having multiple functions. I think you see that connection at the level of our desires. In men, for instance, sexual activity is accompanied by the desire to ejaculate. That's right, I said it. I went there. I said ejaculate. Christians say that too sometimes. My son said, Daddy, can I go to your debate? I said, no. He said, why not? I said, because I'm going to say things like ejaculate. He said, Daddy, what's ejaculate? I said, shoot. I said, well, it means to speak suddenly. Right, but in men, sexual activity is accompanied with the desire to ejaculate. But to ejaculate means to give your procreative potential, to give your fertility. And you don't see that connection between eating and talking, right? You don't start eating and say, oh, this is not going to be any good unless by the end I can give a short address. You don't start a talk and say, by the end of this presentation, I better be eating a hamburger. But you do have that connection at the level of desire between sex and fertility. You have it with women too. A woman's sexual desire peaks at ovulation. In other words, when she's most fertile, she has the greatest desire for sex. Again, there's a connection there, not just at the level of our organs, but at the level of our lived experience, at the level of our desires. And I think that if you are going against the structure of our desires, that's bound to be frustrating. And I think whatever is bound to be frustrating is bound to be unhealthy. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that every time a man and a woman have intercourse, it's going to terminate in a kid. But I think whenever you do sex in such a way that it disconnects sex from fertility, it's unhealthy because it separates what belongs together in the human person. In fact, I think that's a good way to summarize what I've been trying to say so far. I think it's always unhealthy to separate what belongs together in the human person. That's what makes, right, decapitation so unhealthy. If you don't believe me, go see a couple beheadings. You'll be like, you know, he was right. That looks awfully unhealthy. Because it separates what belongs together in the human person, the head and the body. But it's also, for instance, what makes it so unhealthy to disconnect the way you live, your actions, from your beliefs, your convictions. It's unhealthy to disconnect how you live from how you think. That's disintegrated. It's unhealthy because it separates what belongs together in the human person. And by the same token, I think it's unhealthy to separate sex from sexual complementarity and sexually procreative love. Now, there's an objection that I'm sure many of you are thinking about right now. And John may bring this up, I don't know. But I want to address it now. And it's, hey, why does sex have to be about all that stuff? Why does it have to be about complementarity? Why does it have to be about fertility, about procreative potential? Why can't sex just be about giving each other pleasure? And I think there's a couple responses to that objection. First of all, it seems to imply that sex has nothing to do with sex. And that's an awfully counterintuitive claim. It seems to imply that sexual activity, sex, has nothing to do with our objective status as men and women, sex. But then why do we call it sex? Why don't we call it orgasmia or pleasurabilia or something like that? No, we call it sex because our masculinity or femininity is precisely what is supposed to come into play in the act of love that is sex. Secondly, look at the reduced view of the rich phenomenon that is human sexuality that this objection proposes. I'm saying that sex is this pretty amazing thing, this union of two persons, two bodies, two sexes, that it's the completion of the two halves of the human sexual equation, that you're giving someone your procreative potential and seeing what happens. And this objection says, no, you can delete all those things. You can delete that and delete that and delete that and delete that. Sex is just pleasure touching. John talked about reduction. I think whatever side of this debate you're on, you have to acknowledge that to call sex pleasure touching is an incredibly reduced view of human sexuality. But the thing is, whenever you reduce something essentially human, we call that a degradation. That's why it's degrading to reduce the quest for truth to pragmatic concerns. It's degrading to reduce people to their economic value. It's degrading to reduce public debate to rhetorical gimmick. By the same token, I think it's degrading to reduce the great good that is human sexuality to pleasure touching. But that kind of degradation always happens whenever you make a human activity just about the pleasure. Look at eating. If I were to eat only based on what gave me pleasure, I would very quickly develop some profoundly unhealthy eating habits. If I were only to give my kids food based on what gave them pleasure, they would very quickly develop some unhealthy eating habits. In fact, we have a whole class of food that's really just geared toward giving pleasure. Potato chips, popcorn, cotton candy, ice cream. We don't call that health food, right? We call it junk food. What does that say about sex that's just focused on pleasure? Well, the conclusion I'm led to from all of this is that homosexual activity is unhealthy. But it seems to me that in any sexually charged relationship, when something is really wrong with the sex, there's something really wrong with the relationship. If there was a relationship where the sex was abusive, we'd say the relationship was abusive. If there was a relationship where the sex was exploitative, we'd say the relationship was exploitative. And so it seems to me that if there's a relationship where the sexual aspect is unhealthy, then the relationship is unhealthy. Okay, well that brings us to the question of legal recognition of same-sex marriage. First off, I think we have to acknowledge that marriage is a sexually charged relationship. If two people aren't even going to offer themselves to each other sexually, at least at the beginning, I don't know why we'd call that marriage. I think we'd probably just call it friendship, a long, stable, committed maybe friendship. But if a sexually charged relationship, right, if marriage is a sexually charged relationship and a sexually charged relationship between two men and two women, two men or two women, if that's unhealthy, then I think it becomes clear why we don't want our laws to celebrate that. We don't want our laws to endorse or celebrate anything that's not good for people. That's why we don't have policies that celebrate smoking. Now, just real quick, I'm not saying we should outlaw everything unhealthy. I'm not advocating that we outlaw smoking, that we outlaw homosexual relationships, or that we outlaw homosexual activity, but for sure, we shouldn't endorse or celebrate or promote these things. Now, the objection which you hear a lot is, well, you can't legislate morality. You shouldn't legislate morality. I have to be honest, I'm never quite sure what that phrase means. Certainly it's true. Certainly it's true. We ought not to use the law to try and force people to agree with us about what's right and wrong. Certainly that's true. But certainly it's also true that the law is supposed to be an expression of our insights about what's good for people and what's not good for people. We have policies directed to the creation and maintenance of roads because we know that roads are good for people and so they're good for society. As I said, we have no such policies directed to promoting smoking because we recognize that smoking is not good for people and really it's not good for society. So if there were to be this civil recognition of what I've argued is a fundamentally unhealthy situation, that would signal a profound disalignment between our legal structure and what's good for people. And as I understand it, that's the very essence of an unjust law. So that's why I am opposed to legally recognizing same-sex marriage. Thanks very much for your time.
So I told you to lower your expectations. Now I've had 3 seconds to organize this. I want to thank John Mark for his very thoughtful and engaging comments and say that I wish more of our dialogues and debates could be characterized by that kind of thoughtfulness. I really do, because I've been doing this for a long time and it's a rare and delightful opportunity, so thank you. During my opening comments, said something about complementarity, and I segued into a joke about the parts not fitting and this sort of thing. And I did that as a way, to be quite frank, of caricaturing a position that I think that sometimes we hear out there about the complementarity of the sexes, that really that sex is more than that. And what strikes me as interesting here is that as thoughtful and well-considered as John Mark's argument is, in some ways, I fear, its picture of same-sex relationships and its picture of same-sex sexual activity reduces to something like this. When he talks about those sexual relationships as being nothing more than pleasure touching, which I'd never really heard it described that way before, particularly when he talks about the gift that we give in sexuality, where he makes it sound as if when people come together in a romantic relationship, what they're bringing are their parts. And since this other man and I have the same parts, we have nothing to give each other. Now, I think there are a number of fallacies there, but the main one I want to draw your attention to is the really impoverished notion, I think, that this has about sex and what sex is for all couples, not just same-sex couples. Not about bringing my parts, about bringing my maleness, sure, but not in such a way that when somebody else brings that to me sexually, brings that to a relationship sexually, it's just like having a second copy of a DVD that I already have. I mean, because if that were true, I'd probably get pretty bored with it. I mean, it's like, what do I need? I've been with my partner for 11 years. I just realized I've already got it. What do I need you for? Go. But I don't do that. Why? Because it brings something much more. It brings affection that I did not have before. It brings care that I did not have before. It brings a shared experience of beauty that I did not have before. And I think it's easy to look at that and say, well, you guys can just be friends, right? You can hang out, you can set up house together, you can make brunch, you can do whatever gay people do on the weekends. But the sexual part of it, that's just superfluous. And again, I think that John Mark is making the same mistake that he attributes falsely to my side about reducing sex to this pure pleasure-touching mechanistic thing. as opposed to something that is part and parcel of the intimacy that we experience with each other. It's not like we're just buddies who happen to have sex on the side. That's part of the very special intimacy we share with each other, and part of what makes that relationship work. Now, I'm just a philosophy professor. I'm no great poet. It's sort of above my pay grade to explain why sex has that amazing power that it does to create that kind of special intimacy and care. But it does, and I think a lot of us understand that and have experienced that. And I think that for those of us who have experienced it, and for those of us who have seen it in our family and friends and loved ones, the talk about this being fundamentally unhealthy just rings hollow. It's funny, they made the comparison to potato chips. We went out to dinner just before this. We both ordered the same thing, the fish tacos. I thought I was going to be good. I had asparagus on the side. John Mark had French fries on the side. But I think I ate more of his French fries than he did, to be very honest. It was a very... I'm free afterwards. No. But the comparison to junk food. Okay, so we can talk about the ways that excessive amounts of French fries can be bad for you, can be unhealthy for you. But it would seem to me that if you're going to make an argument about these relationships being unhealthy, you'd come armed with all kinds of social science data about how that this is unhealthy. But John Mark didn't, and I don't know if that's because he thought I would shoot it down or he doesn't have it. But I can talk to you about the ways in which we've seen that these relationships actually contribute to people's health and well-being and sense of security and sense of support and just basic happiness, not in this sort of hedonistic, pleasure-touching way, but in a way that really, as I said before, can help them grow, can get them outside of themselves. Because at its best, that kind of sexual relationship can really make you more sensitive to another person, and through that make you more sensitive to the people around you. Frankly, the most valuable thing about my relationship with my partner is that it makes me a better person. It makes me a better family member. It makes me a better citizen through the way in which it makes me a better lover, in the full sense of that term, not in the pleasure-touching sense of that term. One last thing I want to say, and this has to do with the state's interest in all of this. John Mark alluded to the connection between sex and procreation. He suggested that there was a kind of fallacy involved that, if we say that sex is not about procreation, then it's not really about sex. And it depends on how broadly or narrowly you understand what sex is for and what marriage is for, quite frankly. One of the stories I talk about in the book is about a neighbor of mine named Walter. He was in his 70s. He was widowed. And while I was working on the book, Walter announced that he was getting remarried to another person who was widowed. And he and his wife, he and his girlfriend were going to get married. And what did we all say to him? We said, "Congratulations." Why? It wasn't because this was going to lead to children. It wasn't, frankly, because I started thinking about the complementarity of the parts. It was because he had someone to love and be loved by. And I assume that that includes sex, but frankly, I think the state's interest in that relationship goes beyond whatever sex is happening to the fact that there's an intimacy there and someone whose job it is to care for someone else and vice versa. And that's what I see missing from John Mark's picture of marriage and his picture, frankly, of same-sex relationships. And that's what I want to emphasize tonight, that if same-sex marriage is unhealthy, we need to understand where that unhealthiness comes from when we see so many people who find happiness and stability and intimacy and mutual care from those kinds of unions. Thank you.
So, I forgot to say at the beginning, I really want to mention my appreciation for John's work in his real quest for clarity, which is really, I've heard John talk before it. Since I found out about this debate, I've done a lot of research, and I really appreciate how interested he is in the details and getting it right, and I think he's a good example for everyone in that respect. I want to talk first about his parts don't fit segment. I heard that 4 years ago, the first time I went to hear him talk, and I always thought it was kind of a red herring to distract from what seems to me the more obvious fact that the parts don't work together, right? You can take two plugs and fit them together in all kinds of ingenious ways, but you're not going to get an electricity transfer because that's not the way plugs work. The way a man's love as a man works is by uniting his man parts to a woman's woman parts. It's about two parts of the human sexual equation, as I said before, coming together. Because you have the XX people and you have the XY people. Those are the divisions of people into two sexes. So that I think sexually, we're bound to acknowledge that two men will always be sexually two parts, never a whole. Now, as far as the infertile couple's objection goes, like Walter, right, the idea is their sex is no more procreative than homosexual activity. I think that's not true. I think first you have to start by looking at the word fertile. Fertile means conducive to fertilization, which is why we call soil fertile, even when it doesn't have crops growing out of it, because it's conducive to the growing of crops. And you want to be very careful here not to commit the fallacy of division. I'll give you an example. If you break one link in a chain, the entire chain will be broken. But that doesn't mean every individual link in the chain will be broken. If one step in the procreative process is infertile, the process as a whole won't terminate in a kid. But that doesn't mean every step in the process is infertile. Intercourse between a man and a woman is fertile. It is conducive to fertilization. There may be a later step in the process that is not. Maybe not enough sperm issue from the man. Maybe they encounter an obstacle on their itinerary. Maybe there's no egg waiting at journey's end. But that doesn't go back and make that first step of the procreative process, the intercourse between a man and a woman, infertile. But compare that to same-sex activity. There, you don't have fertility. No one would say that homosexual acts are conducive to fertilization. No one would say that they are the first step in any process. They don't need a later step in the process to prevent them from terminating in a child. They are inherently and irredeemably sterile. Now, John said, why would someone kind of find this enriching, right? If I'm saying that sexual acts between a man and a woman can't be sexually complementary, so can't be sexually giving, so they can't be sexually loving, why do people desire them? Why would anyone desire what they already have? Right? Well, I think in some cases, when we desire something we already have, it's because we don't know we already have it. There are a lot of people out there who have been told either by their parents or by their classmates that they don't qualify as men, maybe by word, maybe by gesture. That they don't have the wealth of masculinity, that they don't have the richness, and so maybe they're looking to get it from someone else. But I want to say that's not true. Gay men qualify every bit as much as men as straight men. They have the same resources, the same riches. They have the same gift to give. They don't have some kind of lack that needs to be supplemented. And, the fact is, when we recognize that there's something morally problematic about an activity, we don't kind of just take the testimony that this is enriching at face value. There's a great book by J.M. Coetzee called Disgrace, where a teacher uses his position to kind of sexually manipulate a student. And then, of course, the scandal breaks, and they put a mic in front of his mouth, and he says, "No, I don't regret it. It was enriching." Well, of course, we, the readers, don't believe him, because we recognize that there was something morally problematic about his behavior. And it takes him time to realize the same thing. John mentioned stats a couple times, both in the first speech and then in the rebuttal. And so I'd like to quote from him the reason, this is my advantage, right? The reason why I didn't bring stats. He said, an obvious problem with this tack, the tack of turning to statistics, is that both sides of the debate bring forth extensive statistics and expert testimony, leaving the average observer confused. I quite agree. I think statistics in this case are valuable for illustrating the truth that we find first through moral analysis. And that's why, yes, I do have statistics, but I think this discussion is more interesting right now. Also, I want to say this again. I certainly wasn't characterizing anyone's relationship, least of all yours and Mark's, has been merely pleasure touching. I think what you haven't done maybe is you haven't distinguished between the different kinds of complementarity, like I tried to do. Physical complementarity, personal complementarity, sexual complementarity. I think there can't be sexual complementarity there. John himself, in his example of Bob and Larry, he acknowledged that complementarity requires difference. Why are Bob and Larry personally complementary? Because their personalities are different. Therefore, why can't Bob and Larry be sexually complementary? Because they have the same sex. I don't think you can ignore those distinctions. Finally, I think it's important to say that we have to decide, does sex matter or doesn't it? In a sense, it sounded to me like John was saying, well, listen, we can't put so much weight on sex, but then in another segment you said, no, sex is core, sex is crucial, and sex is central to many of our human relationships, which you wrote in a great paper called Are We Defined by Our Sexuality? I think we have to say this does matter, and then it can taint a relationship as a whole if the sexual component is misdirected. Does gay marriage threaten straight marriage? I think clearly it does. I think once you start deleting loves from the sexual and marital equation, it's going to happen that people say, well, wait a minute. We've just expressed as a culture through our legal system that you no longer need sexual complementarity in a marriage. Well, maybe you don't need permanence. We've just discussed that you don't need fertility in a marriage. Well, then maybe you don't need fidelity. These people have redefined marriage to suit their own preferences. Why don't we redefine marriage to suit our own preferences? And when that happens, that will be the utter dismantling of marriage. I think it is a risk. I think, too, that... How much time do I have, JT? 2 minutes. Wow, I'm swimming. All right. John mentioned some very kind of heart-rending and important cases to consider about legal benefits, medical benefits, right? People who self-identify as gay need someone to take care of them too. I think that's a good point. I think the question, though, is how can we better enable people to extend legal medical privileges to those they're not married to? Maybe I want to extend some financial or medical benefits to someone I'm not married to. Honey, it's not true. I'm just using it as an example. And I think that's a very valuable discussion to have, but I think that's a very different question than the question, who can or should get married? Finally, John talked about incest, bestiality, and polygamy. And I want to emphasize that on my view, and on the view of many people, same-sex marriage is not about expanding marriage. It's about reducing it. As I tried to point out, it's about deleting loves from the equation. And so once you start doing that, again, it's kind of hard to see which love you'll delete next. Maybe you will delete love for your partner next. After all, a lot of people love themselves deeply, are committed to themselves, plan on staying with themselves till death, and may have a very vigorous sex life with themselves. You see, marriage is contracting. Who's to say that the next step won't be maybe polygamy, bestiality, or incest? Maybe the next step will be marrying yourself. And then we will really have seen how shrunken our idea of sex and marriage can become. Thank you very much.
John, you mentioned the need for marriage in order to have legal rights for hospital visitation, finances, etc. I am a Catholic priest and thus have no spouse to handle this automatically. I must arrange for my affairs on my own. Why not homosexuals?
Well, I didn't suggest that legal marriage was the only way to provide for care. What I said was that these legal incidents are part of the package of marriage, the legal package of marriage, which are the way in which, first of all, we provide certain tools for caregiving for a couple, but also the way in which we legally recognize people as a household unit. And I think part of the problem we see with the lack of this kind of recognition is that there are same-sex couples, whether you agree with them morally or not, who do merge their lives and their property in this way and don't have the state acknowledge this choice that they've made. And for me, part of it is about the freedom to for them to make this kind of choice and be able to decide who it is going to be their person of first response in the hospital and so on. Frankly, I mean, if we were just talking about hospital visitation, then I'd say, yeah, I mean, as a priest, you should be able to designate someone to be able to do that too. But what I was trying to talk about is the way in which marriage provides a kind of legal merging of lives as it also involves a kind of personal and social merging of lives.
John Mark, are you saying straight?
Do we want to give each other the opportunity to?
Well, that's all up to you guys.
Yeah, if you want. I mean, we don't need to each time, but
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add.
Gave you the
Thank
next question eyes, and I was acquiescing to that.
Okay.
No, I'm fine for my question, yeah.
John Mark, are you saying straight people don't enjoy anal sex or oral sex?
Oh, no, of course not. What I'm saying is that pleasure is not a good moral guideline for whether behavior is right or not. I mentioned that with eating, but I think John's pointed that out. I have a quote here, but people enjoy all sorts of things that aren't good for them. Sometimes they enjoy things that are violent. Sometimes they enjoy things that are nasty. I'm not describing homosexual acts that way, but I'm trying to show this principle that whether somebody enjoys something isn't an indicator that it's morally laudable.
I agree with John Mark on that, but I also think that it's not automatically an indicator that it's bad for them either. And one of the concerns I have about the argument is that it suggests that if sex were only about pleasure, now I actually made an argument for it being about something greater than that and personal growth and getting outside of yourself and all of that, but if it were just about pleasure, would that necessarily be a bad thing? And I don't see that it would be, any more than the fact that sometimes we eat a cookie just because it's pleasurable, not because we need further nourishment, that would be a bad thing.
Can I respond?
Please.
Yeah, great, okay. Yeah, I think...
I'm still looking for a question I can read.
Great, okay. I think really you can kind of go across the board and see if you do something just for the pleasure on a regular basis, you ruin the activity. If you do it with sleeping, you become a sloth. Right? You become, it's like that Jim Gaffigan thing, right? If you use that snooze button all the time so that every day your first decision is, I'll go back to bed. That's problematic. The same with friendship. If your friendship is just geared around pleasure and the pleasure you get out of the friend, you're really using the friend for your own. And we have a term for that. We call it a fair weather friend. And again, it's reduced and so it's degraded. I think the cookie example or the French fries, those are not purely just for pleasure, right? They're not made out of rocks. Pica is a good example. Pica is a condition that some pregnant women experience where they want to eat plaster. Now, we consider that unhealthy even if they say it gives them pleasure because it does not have any nutritive value. I think that's a good case where you see an activity just geared towards pleasure, even with eating, that needs to be discouraged, not celebrated.
What would you say about chewing sugarless gum purely for the pleasure of the gum? It's not going to provide you any nourishment.
Well, first of all, chewing, right, isn't just a digestive function. Secondly... Sex
isn't just a pleasure function, right?
No, definitely not. No, definitely not.
It can provide exercise, like chewing.
That's right, it can, yes. That's right. Yeah, well, I think if we reduce if we reduce sex to exercise,
Let's talk about the chewing. I'm sorry.
Oh, we want to talk about the sugarless gum. Yeah. Sugarless gum, yeah, I think if that serves some other purpose that is good for the body, so for instance, a lot of people chew sugarless gum to avoid smoking and then to avoid eating what's not healthy for them. It strengthens the jaws. You can find all kinds of biological benefits, right?
Yeah.
Besides
I'm not
which,
going to
right?
talk about what sex strengthens.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that's a good point too, though, right? That at some point we recognize that sexuality, as you've written on very eloquently, is much more core to our personality and to our relationships than something like moving our jaws up and down. Sure. And so the analogy starts to break down pretty quickly.
Well, I mean, the analogy, what I'm trying to say here is that you seem to be suggesting that an activity pursued just for the pleasure of it is necessarily bad or necessarily disordered or disconnected from other important things. And I don't think that's true. And I think that we could talk about, I don't know, just lighting a lavender-scented candle and just for the sake of the pleasure of it. We can talk about things. Now, I'm not suggesting, I want to make this very clear, that that's why we ought to pursue sex all the time. I think I tried. I don't know that John Mark heard it very well, but I tried to make an argument for sexual intimacy that went well beyond. I mean, which is why I thought it was funny when you concluded with this idea of, you know, that the end result of this is just marrying ourselves. I think what makes relationships valuable is the way they get us outside of ourselves. So it seems like the opposite of what I'm talking about.
There's a couple things, and
I'm sorry,
JT,
but we're having fun up here.
Yeah,
so.
It's good times. Yeah, I think a couple things. One is, since you have done such a good job discussing how sex is supposed to be about relationship and relationship building, when I talked about the pleasure touching objection, I really wasn't sure whether you'd bring it up or not, and I mentioned that because that doesn't seem to fit very well with your ethical understanding of sexuality, but I do think a lot of people may take it for granted sometimes. Secondly, when you talk about getting out of yourself, it's precisely by giving to someone what they don't have and by receiving from someone what you don't have that you expand your horizons. That's the whole idea of love. That's the whole idea of giving, is that it does force you to transcend your own borders. Yeah. And so if you're engaging in sexuality where you already have, right, you're engaging in the sex with a mirror sexual component, not on every level, just on the sexual level, that's why we say same sex, that you're not expanding your sexual horizons.
Yeah, and this is one place where I think we fundamentally disagree, and I think it's helpful to clarify this disagreement. That I thoroughly disagree that having sex with somebody of the same sex means that you are not getting outside of yourself, transcending your sexual borders, because I think sexuality is so intimately tied to things like intimacy, things like power and vulnerability, pride and shame, closeness and isolation, and all these other important things, that does force you to transcend, even if you are with someone of the same sex, and also that for some of us, that's the way that kind of special intimacy happens. I mean, just in terms of the reality of our lives. But you and I have a very different notion, I think, of what can happen in a same-sex sexual act.
I am actually going to cut it off there. I'll endeavor to give the last word on questions to you, and I'll endeavor to give John Mark you the last word on questions to John Corvino.
Okay.
Dr. Corvino, do you support legal polygamy? What if social science data were to suggest that polygamous relationships lead to healthy outcomes for adults and children? On what basis would you legislate that gay couples can marry and that polygamous consenting adults who love each other cannot?
If my argument were simply consenting adults who love each other should be able to marry, then yes, it would seem to follow that polygamous couples should be able to marry. But my argument is more complex than that, because I recognize that marriage is a social institution, and so we have to talk about society's interests here. And here's what we know historically, that polygamous societies tend to be polygynous, that is, one man, multiple wives, and that those societies tend not only to have rampant sexism, but also significant class differences where we have high status males acquiring multiple wives, lower status males have become virtually unmarriageable. And so from the standpoint of social stability, which is part of my argument, it seems to me like a bad idea. But I've not investigated it very thoroughly. I don't think that there's an important connection between the two because, look, I mean, I don't think that marrying one man means that we should be able to marry multiple partners any more than the fact that you can marry one woman means that you should be able to marry multiple partners. I think they're different questions. If social science data were to show that legalizing polygamy would be good for the adults and good for children, wouldn't have the social cost that it's had in the past, I'd say I'd be okay with it, personally.
Yeah. So, actually, I think this gets to the heart of maybe where we disagree a little bit. I think there are all kinds of loving relationships where you do all the things that John seems to find so uniquely in the sexual encounter. I think you find them in all well-meaning human encounters on some level. Experience of beauty was one you mentioned, vulnerability, power. You do find those. What makes sex distinctive? That's the question I think that we have to deal with. And I've expressed that a lot of different ways. Let me try this one, which will affect polygamy, believe it or not. I think sex is...
I'm disturbed you pointed at me when you said that.
That's right, yes.
He's taking you out to dinner now.
That's right. I have a big credit card. I think sex is supposed to be where someone, well, I think what it is, right, is where you kind of give yourself physically. You give yourself, right, here's me, here's all of me, here's me naked. Here's my genetic material, take it. We'll see what happens. And I think since you're giving everything physically, which as I've tried to indicate, I don't even think on that level homosexual activity can be a full physical gift of self even because the procreative potential can't be given in a meaningful way. But if you do that physically, if you're giving yourself completely on a physical level, I think it's proper that you accompany that with a pretty radical self-gift on the personal level. You say, here's everything I am physically. Let me try to give you in all the ways it's possible for one human being to give himself to another or herself. Let me try to give you that way too, forever, always, procreatively, all the time, right? And polygamy, like infidelity, like promiscuity, kind of makes a farce of that, right? It says, I'm giving myself completely to you, except when I'm giving it to her, right? You mean the world to me, so does she. Right? And that doesn't work. And so it's intimately tied with my understanding of the complete gift, as complete as it's possible for two human beings, that's supposed to happen within the context of sexuality.
Yeah, I had some stuff. I had some stuff I wanted to say there, but yeah, okay. What would be your objection to, if you had any objection to, a same-sex romantic kiss?
Well, it depends what society we're living in. In this society, kiss
romantic kiss.
A romantic kiss, right. Yeah. Romantic seems to me to be sexually charged.
Yes.
Right? And something that's sexually charged means something that has an inherent impetus towards genital activity. It's something that's, if it's not arousing, it's at least supposed to get the ball rolling, or it's supposed to indicate that there's a mutual arousal that can or should happen.
I would almost say it's supposed to create the kind of electricity that you said you couldn't do with two plugs, right?
Well,
I mean, this is my point.
No, electricity there meant complementarity and doing what it's supposed to do.
But you seem to think that electricity requires the complementarity. What I'm suggesting is that sometimes the act of just kissing somebody in a passionate and romantic way can be a way of communicating something to them that, you keep saying, well, what is it distinctively sexual about it, as if what we're talking about has to be the kind of thing that only can be achieved with sex and is always achieved with sex. I think that sex has a lot of important characteristic features, which is not to say that there aren't other ways in which people achieve intimacy and so on.
What's distinctive about it, all these important features? What makes sex unique, if not the sexual component?
But my point, I can talk about what's distinctive about it, although, again, I'm not a poet, I don't always do the best job with that. But my point right now is that it doesn't have to be distinctive in order for it to be a valuable and worthwhile thing to do. I mean, like, what's distinctive about wearing a jacket to be warm? I could wear a sweater to be warm. I could be warm in other ways, but it doesn't follow that it's therefore wrong for me to wear a jacket to be warm.
What's distinctive importantly distinct about sex as opposed to other forms of human activity? We both seem to think there is.
Well,
as opposed to the jacket sweater.
I would grant this to you, that sex is the only kind of activity that well, actually no, and I'm not even going to put it that way. Because obviously people are able to procreate without actually having sex now, so that's not even the point I'm going to make. I think that there are important characteristic features of sex and a phenomenologically distinctive way in which that expresses our feelings. The way it feels,
lots of things, right? Express our feelings. I mean, it sounds to me.
Please take the last word here.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I don't want to interrupt.
No, my point is simply that part of what sex does is to communicate a kind of passionate affection to something in a way that writing a letter or giving just other things don't do. Now, can I explain exactly why that is beyond the fact that most people understand that writing a letter is just no substitute for this? I don't know what else I can say, but there is something characteristic and important about that.
Right, I agree. And I think the difference between us is that you can't articulate what's distinctive about sex, and I can.
Well,
and
I don't
that
think
it's an expression of ourself as men and as women.
Well, if you think that...
Dr. Corvino?
Yeah.
I did give him the last word.
You did,
Sorry.
that's right.
John Mark, how would you define what is natural?
Oh, it depends on the context. When it comes to sexuality, and when people talk about natural, unnatural, when they talk about morality, especially in the intellectual tradition in which I was formed, natural means what's good for people, and unnatural means what's not good for people. Natural means how people flourish, what makes people flourish. Unnatural means what doesn't make people flourish. So there's a lot of confusion a great deal of the time. John's done a great job with this, and he's got some great ways of expressing it that I probably shouldn't express, about how we ought not to take our sexual principles from the natural world of the subhuman animals. It's also true that I don't see technology as unnatural. So if natural were being used in a moral context, if I were saying we should do only what's natural, we should not do what's unnatural, natural would be there simply a correspondence with what is fulfilling to the human person.
I'm happy to agree with that definition of natural, but then also go on to argue that same-sex relationships can be natural by that definition insofar as they cause fulfillment to the human person.
I don't think there's any disagreement there.
Well, on what I just said, I hope there's some disagreement.
On the way we're using the word natural, that's right.
Yes.
John Corvino.
Yes.
You characterize same-sex marriage as being between two unrelated people.
Right.
Why? No risk of genetic defect, right?
No, but I don't think that the taboo against incest is just there to prohibit or to eliminate the risk of genetic defect. I also think it has something to do about the way in which the kind of passion associated with sex. And you're right, I don't think I articulate this better than any other person who's not, again, a poet or someone who can speak with great literary talent about what it is that makes sex special. But I do think that when we introduce that to family life, to brothers and sisters, to fathers and daughters and so on, there's a case where we very clearly see the potential for harm. I talk about this a little bit in the book. So for that reason, I think we prohibit incest, not just because of genetic defects.
Yeah, honestly, I thought John did a really good job in a lot of the books when he was talking about incest and you quoted someone. I found that the weakest part because, again, I don't think you distinguish adequately between the different forms of complementarity. So, for instance, I said that I don't think homosexual activity is healthy because there's not sexual complementarity because you're dealing with one sex. I don't think bestiality is healthy because there's no personal complementarity because you're just dealing with one person because I don't think animals are persons. And I think that incest is problematic because there's not enough biological complementarity. Because even though you're not dealing with the same body, you're dealing with two bodies that are so similar in structure that the complementarity physically is drastically reduced. And I think that the birth defects are some kind of expression of that, but not the core of what makes it problematic.
What would make incest wrong then when we're talking about adopted children who are not genetically similar?
Well, first of all, if I'm not mistaken, we don't have laws against incest between, for instance, two adopted children when they're adopted from two different families. In fact, what was that good movie? It was the Royal Tenenbaums, right? That was part of the whole dynamic there. They're working that out. And I certainly haven't decided that issue one way or the other, but I would have a hard time.
It would seem to me that, I mean, you have children, I do not, but if my two 12, 13-year-old adopted children started saying they wanted to date each other, I'd put the kibosh on that real fast.
Yeah. Well, you're talking to a traditional dude, and so I'd put the kibosh on 13-year-olds dating in the first place.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
John Mark.
Yep.
If same-sex marriage is made legal, what's to stop the government from saying that a homosexual couple who are Catholic can't have a justice of the peace witness their marriage in a Catholic church?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I quite understood. Could you repeat that?
If same-sex marriage is made legal, what's to stop the government from saying that a homosexual couple who are Catholic can't have a justice of the peace witness their marriage in a Catholic church?
Yeah, well, okay, so first of all, I'm pretty sure that Catholic churches don't generally let justice of the peaces witness their marriage in the building. So I don't know that that would be a big problem because it doesn't happen with heterosexual couples anyway. But I do want to say that I hope John is right, and I'm not sure he is, but I hope he's right, that the recognition of same-sex marriage will not lead to religious organizations being forced to do things that go against their religious code, like marry same-sex couples. I think we've seen that in certain areas, even things that are going on right now. And I think, in a sense, this doesn't prove my argument at all. But it does give people like me and people who agree with me a greater cause to be nervous when we say, well, wait, we very much disagree, but we've seen that when we disagree both morally and religiously with the laws that are expressed, it can sometimes interfere with the exercise of our religious beliefs. And as I've said, that's not an argument that I'm right, but it does make me very nervous, and I think for good reason.
I would simply point out that at the present time, the Roman Catholic Church does not allow people who divorce to remarry in a Catholic church unless they've had an annulment, and the state can't force it to do that. So why this would be any different, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm thinking not of that case so much, but obviously in the one that's in the media right now, requiring Catholic organizations to pay for things that they don't want to pay for in ways that they're not comfortable paying for. And again, I don't want to get into the specifics. Yeah, sure. It does get complicated. Just to say that I don't think the separation of church and state is so absolute that they don't touch at some vital places. And I think that's worth considering, especially if you think as I do.
John Corvino. In light of our country's policy of separation of church and state, how can our government justify the endorsement of a religious institution over secular civil unions? A religious ceremony is not legal without government recognition, e.g. civil union.
Could you repeat that? I didn't...
Happily. You have to double my pay, though.
Yes, sir.
Cool.
In light of our country's policy of separation of church and state, how can our government justify the endorsement of a religious institution over secular civil unions? A religious ceremony is not legal without government recognition, e.g. civil union.
Yeah, you're right. So if a person simply goes to a church to get married and doesn't file legal paperwork, they are not recognized as legally married or civilly married. But I think it's important to distinguish civil union and civil marriage. The institution that we have now when you go to a justice of the peace as husband and wife and so on, that's civil marriage. Civil union is actually a term, was invented originally in the state of Vermont as a way to try to give the statewide legal incidence of marriage to same-sex couples without using the M word. And so it's not that marriage is the religious thing and civil union is the civil thing. We have something called civil marriage, and I think one of the things that's confusing is that we use the term marriage for both the civil thing and the religious thing. I'm not sure that answers the question. The question, I apologize, JT. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
In light of our country's policy of
separation of church and state. Okay, so the idea is that right now, when you get civilly married, it really is something separate from what's going on in the church at that time, even though people do it at the same time. I think it's right. There's something sort of confusing about this, that we give religious ministers this power. Of course, I have this power, you have this power, right? We've both performed weddings, I believe.
Oh, sorry, I was busy reading.
We've both performed weddings, yes? We're both?
No, I've been asked to, and I could, but I never have.
Okay, so yes, I'm saying that when we give religious ministers the power to officiate at a civil marriage ceremony, that's not necessarily tied to any particular religion or particular religious beliefs. In fact, we even allow atheists to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I missed something, but I could...
I think I said the word atheist. And
okay. Yeah, in a sense, again, I'm not quite sure I got the question, but as a Catholic, certainly I'm happy having some level of distinction between civil marriage and what we consider sacramental marriage, because I think that in our view, in the Catholic view, grace builds on nature, and so we're concerned about what happens at nature, and we're concerned about what happens at grace, and we do consider, as I said before, that there's some connection between those two. So I don't really mind there being a distinction. When they get obviously too far apart, I think that's a sign that something has gone wrong with the civil side, besides just its distinction from. But again, it sounded to me like the question was, is there a problem with there being a distinction between civil marriage and Christian sacramental marriage? I don't think there is a problem with that.
I think that is the last word there.
Yep.
John Mark, why must sex be complementary if most every other facet of a couple's relationship is complementary and satisfying?
Well, because I think loving in a radical way is very difficult, and it demands that you give in as many different ways as you can. And I think that means that you love in as many ways that you can, but for that to happen, as I said, I think you have to be complementary in as many ways. I'll try to venture here sort of a definition of marriage and see how it works, but basically that's what I think makes sex and marriage so incredible, is that it's the most multifaceted network of love that is available between two people. So, for instance, I don't think every relationship does have to have a sexually complementary aspect. All my male friendships don't have sexually complementary aspects. They're very satisfying. But they're not sexual, because that wouldn't be sexually loving, as I tried to point out.
Yeah, this is where I think we have another fundamental disagreement, and it's worth sort of bringing this out as well as we can. To me, from where I stand, it sounds like the argument is very abstract, talking about the complementarity of the sexes and bringing the maleness and the femaleness together and so on. And there's all of that abstract stuff that sounds good about what sex does and how it fits together and so on. And then there's the reality of people's lives, where some people fall in love with persons of the same sex. Don't just have this sort of pleasure stuff, but fall in love with persons of the same sex. And you're right, there's something that you said in your rebuttal that I thought, I wanted to say, yes, I agree. You're right that sometimes we are deceived about what's good for us, that we think that something is genuinely fulfilling when it turns out not to be. But it seems, for example, a person might think, taking drugs feels really good, and that's why they do it, but then those of us around them say, you know what, this is not good for you. It seems to me that one of the reasons we see the shift in this country that we do, and if you look at Gallup polls now on same-sex marriage compared to when I started doing this 10, 20 years ago, there's a real shift in favor of support for marriage equality, and I think the reason that you see that is because, not just because same-sex couples fall in love and experience this as loving and fulfilling, but because the people around them do, their families do. The fact that my parents regard Mark as their son-in-law is part of what they're seeing there, is that this is something healthy and fulfilling, and that's where you put all of that real experience against sort of abstract stuff about the complementarity and what's happening. It's like, well, that's not what happened when I was around women. I never really seriously dated women because I just didn't have that kind of love for them, but I do have that kind of love for someone of the same sex, and that's the piece that real world piece is the piece that's missing from your argument for me.
I have the last word on that?
Yeah, you can have multiple words here. I don't see
Oh, yay. Okay. I have to say, I'm kind of, I don't want to gloat, but John is such a rational, analytic dude. He is so clear when it comes to what he calls now the abstract, that I can only conclude that in retreating to an experiential plane that is beyond me and really beyond everyone, it's really something accessible only to him, and I would say something accessible only to him and God. That if he's retreated to that plane where he knows that we can't have a meaningful debate, it seems to me he must be short on some sort of argument. He must be running a little shy of rational currency on this issue, and to me that's as close as I can hope to a win.
Yeah. Well, don't count on the retreat yet, because I don't see the discussion of experience as retreat. In fact, I think the avoidance of discussion of experience is really quite telling in this. I mean, go to one of the examples or analogies we looked at, having to do with drugs. I had a friend a number of years ago who got very involved with crystal meth. Terrible, awful stuff. He at the time thought, oh, it's cool, I'm having fun, I had it under control. All of us around him could see. And it's not because not because we could get inside of our minds. Sure, in some sense, experience is radically subjective. I can't have your experience, you can't have my experience. But I do think that we can look around us and genuinely evaluate, that these kinds of things are healthy and loving. These kinds of things really sort of bring out the best in people, and these things don't. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the love that exists in these kinds of sexual relationships, that the kinds of complementarity and pairing that we see there. And then when I talk about your abstract thing, it's not that I don't see how it all fits together. It's just that it seems to me that even if you grant that there's some kind of value just in the bringing together of the male and the female and the multifacets and so on, that's not the only value in the vicinity. So I think there's a sort of persistent non sequitur in the argument.
I appreciate very deeply the value of testimony, the value of first-hand accounts. I do not want to dismiss those by any stretch, but I do think that is not what brings two people together for a debate. I think a debate has to be based on evidence that is accessible to everyone and that is able to be clearly explained. Otherwise, I think it becomes something where either two people really share what they feel and they share their stories, or, as you said, it's a battle of statistics. And certainly, right, there are a bunch of people on both sides who say, no, look, we can see how great and fulfilling this is. There's a ton of people, just a ton of people, right, who keep saying, some of them, right, one of my good friends in the audience is a man who has a profound testimony on the destructiveness of the gay lifestyle. Now, I'm not going to come up and ask him to witness because I don't think that's what this is about. But when you have recourse to that, I think it's really ending the discussion on the rational level.
It ends the discussion on the rational level to talk about people's real experience and what gives value to their lives?
It does when it's something that I have to take your word for.
No, you don't have to take my word for it just because John Corvino said so, therefore it must be true. I'm talking about the evidence people see before their eyes, not just looking at me, one person, but the same-sex couples that they know and love in their own lives.
Right.
I mean, what you seem to be doing is suggesting that any appeal to empirical evidence and the experience that people have in relationship is not relevant to a rational debate, and that's just bizarre to me.
Okay, so...
John Mark, please take one more turn, and then Corvino, please take the last word, please.
Okay.
Okay, great. Again, I do think that's important in understanding issues. If that's the direction you'd like to go in, I can invite my friend up who has this more in-depth experience of the destructiveness of the gay lifestyle on multiple levels, and you and he can share before the audience. But again, that seems to me to say that you don't have a clear argument left, and that this is what we've come to, which is okay. Maybe that's the place in the discussion we've come to, and I've done what I can, and you've done what you can, and now we'll move on to a next phase. But otherwise, I think if we're going to keep talking here, we have to keep talking about what's accessible to both of us.
Well, I'll just leave it to the audience to decide whether I have a clear argument when I talk about the happiness in people's lives and the kinds of things they bring the relationships bring to them. And I mean, to some extent, I can appeal to their experience of love and relationship and how that plays itself out in their lives, and try by analogy to help them appreciate what this means in the lives of same-sex couples. That's the best I can do in terms of trying to paint a fuller picture, without which I think we're really not talking about something fundamentally human and important to us as humans.
To clarify there, the reason I gave John Corvino the last word is because I said earlier on questions to you, I would try to give him the last word and vice versa, and that question had been addressed to you. So, John Corvino, your turn. What is the number of parents a child of same-sex parents has? 2, 3, or 4? Is gender unimportant?
I never would say that gender is unimportant. Obviously, I must give some recognition to gender, I'm gay, right? So if gender were not important to me, or if I didn't notice it, if it were not significant to me in any way, that claim wouldn't even make sense in a way. In terms of children of same-sex couples, look, everybody is a child of two biological parents, but I also recognize that it takes more than biological parenthood to make someone a mother or father. I can talk about my own experience of my own mother and father still married to each other after 45 years, and those were my parents. Some people are raised by single parents, some people are raised by two same-sex parents, some people are raised by grandparents and so on. So I can't answer that question in a general way. If you're asking me biologically, the child has two parents. If you're asking me who was the real family in that child's life, that's going to vary from child to child.
Before I answer this, how much time do we have left tonight?
We have about 15 minutes.
Okay, great. Yeah. Again, what I said would just be an extension of what I've said already, that I think it's an unhealthy relationship, and so to place a child in that setting is, while it may be loving in many respects, is at least in that respect problematic, because it says maybe not that gender is unimportant, but gender is ultimately dispensable. Right? And there's a big difference, I think, between a child who's in a context where it's kind of acknowledged, listen, this is not the ideal situation. You deserve better, maybe we're trying to get you better. But when you say to a child, either explicitly or implicitly, this is exactly what we want. We planned out a family without a mother. We planned out a family without a father, without a husband, without a wife. I think that's going to really, in practice, if not explicitly, send the message that, yeah, sexual complementarity is expendable. And I think that's not a true message.
John Mark, do you believe there is a separation between the body and the spirit, a oneness? Perhaps John Corvino does not see fullness of body.
Sorry, a separation between body and spirit.
Yes, sir.
Perhaps John Corvino does not see fullness of body.
That's what it says.
Would a full-figured person please stand up so that John Corvino can see fullness of body? Yeah, I mean, this is obviously something I don't think we can argue about here, although obviously this is in some sense a fitting setting. But yeah, I do think that the body and the soul are distinct and united. I think that what happens to one affects the other, how you live with one affects the other, that personality lives through the body, such that what it does with the body is important to the soul and important to the personality. And at least when I substitute personality for soul, I imagine John agrees with me about a lot of that. But again, I'm not totally sure if I understood the objection fully.
Yeah, if you put in personality, I mean, I think I would say that there's something significant about our bodies and our personalities and so on. And I mean, going back to what we were discussing earlier, I mean, if you want to keep this at what we've been labeling the abstract level, I think part of what I've been trying to say, perhaps somewhat inarticulately, is that to go from the premise about complementarity of bodies, you start with the complementarity of the male-female bodies and recognize that there's something good about that, it does not follow. It is a non sequitur that there are not other good things in sex. To claim that the only good of sex is that bodily complementarity would be a non sequitur, and that's what I've been trying to say, not very articulately tonight.
Can I go and then he goes, so he gets the last word?
Yeah, by all means.
Great, good.
If I feel the conversation has wound down, or if we're running too long, I'll cut you off. And until then, you guys just knock yourselves out.
All right, figuratively. Yeah, in my opening speech, I really tried to be very careful to distinguish physical complementarity from sexual complementarity, which is why, remember, I said that a small point guard and a large center, or two acrobats or something, they're physically complementary because they're two different bodies. I think, again, for not just for our discussion of homosexuality, but as I mentioned, for our discussion of other sexual issues, I think complementarity is the key to unlocking so much. And I think you have to distinguish between those three levels: personal, physical, and sexual. I think once you know that someone's a person, you still don't know what sex they are. Once you know that someone is a person with a body, once you know that someone is physical, you still don't know what sex they are. So I think that makes it very clear. Once you know someone's physical dimensions, you still don't know their personality. My point is that even though there's overlap between these three areas, body, person, sex, there's still distinction, and that distinction really matters.
Okay, and I guess I would just reword my point and say that just because there is sexual complementarity and just because we recognize something good in sexual complementarity, it does not follow that there aren't other goods to be achieved in sex.
Well, okay then. John Corvino.
Yes.
How much weight does your own sexuality hold over your views of same-sex marriage? To put it differently, if you were heterosexual, would you hold the same views?
I'd hate gay people. No, I mean, it's hard to answer that question, right? Because, I mean, I am a gay person. One of the things that I have always felt really strongly about, and I think John Mark will agree with me on this, is that an argument should be evaluated on whether the premises are true and whether they support the conclusion, not on who's giving the argument. If the person giving the argument turns out to be a hypocrite, turns out to be an axe murderer, turns out to be whatever. I mean, if the argument is good, it's still good. If the argument was bad, it was still bad. It's still bad. So yeah, I give this argument as a gay man, which means on the one hand, I know something about what gay life is like, and that's part of the data point I think that belongs in this argument. On the other hand, you might say, well, I'm biased because I'm a gay man, and the best we can do is just to evaluate the argument on its merits.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much true. Actually, John and I talked about this a little at dinner tonight when we were talking about the gentleman giving the blurb. And I was saying, I don't mind someone saying, well, that's a typical Catholic argument. I don't mind that. I don't mind acknowledging that my background and my experience and my commitments are really coming into play in the types of arguments I use and why I feel passionately about them. I think it's best if we both acknowledge at the beginning, we both stand a lot to lose if we're wrong, and go from there.
Yeah, true.
John Mark, since you're under the impression that a healthy sexual relationship requires sexual complementarity, how do you come to terms for those with both male and female sexual organs? Do these individuals both complement and negate their chosen partner? Do they not deserve to have a sexual relationship? Do you think them incapable of fertile relationships even if they were incapable of producing an egg or sperm?
Yeah. So I think it's very dangerous to hinge your arguments based on what the medical community would call a birth defect. Right? I think that's probably not where you want to say, well, this is the essence of humanity. We can delineate it this way, right? You don't want to say, well, listen, the eye isn't necessarily for seeing because some people are born blind. And I think the same here, right? And it's quite true. In some cases, you need some pretty detailed analysis to find out whether the person is male or female. I think it's almost unheard of. Maybe there's a few cases where a person is born with two sets of genitals, both capable of reproduction. And there, I don't know kind of what the process is, but I don't think it undermines the view that we all share, whether on the common sense level or on the medical level or even on the chromosomal level, that humanity is divided into men and women.
And I guess I see a richer picture of humanity, where I see humanity is generally divided into men and women, but that there are genuinely intersex people, and they need to be part of our data as well.
John Corvino, what about AIDS, unhealthy physically?
Of course. Duh. My answer to that is duh. AIDS is unhealthy physically, but I can have sex with an HIV-negative man for days on end and not contract AIDS. Fatigue, yes. AIDS, no. AIDS is caused by the HIV virus. That virus can be passed along by homosexual activity. It can be passed along by heterosexual activity. It can be passed along by blood transfusions. And I think it's a real mistake when we start pointing to people and making blanket claims. It's like saying with women, you shouldn't engage in heterosexual activity because you're more likely to contract AIDS, so go lesbian. No, I mean, that would just be a crazy argument.
Yeah, I think for the most part, no, almost exclusively, I agree. I do think those types of questions about statistical data, questions about health, and even to an extent, questions about testimony, are valuable but always come after the more foundational analysis, which says, how can we tell, just looking at the structure of the human person, whether this is right or wrong? And then from that we say, okay, now how do we see this illuminated one way or the other? So I would certainly never cite the AIDS data as my evidence that homosexuality is immoral. I don't think that's a good place to start at all.
I'm going to close by usurping the right of the moderator to ask a question of both of you, and I would like to kill debate on this one. I would just like to ask a question of each of you. It's no mystery that this room is divided into half Catholic and half unbeliever, and it's also no secret that the gay marriage argument tends to run along religious lines. It tends to be an elephant in the room whenever this conversation is brought up. So for you, John Mark, if you could somehow know that your religion was untrue, just hypothetically, I'm not asking you to admit that,
sure,
would your argument change? And if so, I don't want to cause difficulty between you and Jessica.
That's right, yeah. That's right.
But how would your argument change if it would at all?
Yeah, plug your ears, honey. I'd have to say I think about three things. First off, asking me what would be the case if my religion weren't true, and this is a much longer conversation, but it's kind of like asking. Okay, it's kind of like saying, who would you cheat on your wife with, right? I don't even kind of like to think of that, because for me it's not an abstract proposition; it's a relationship that I have with a person. So I don't kind of like to imagine those scenarios. Secondly, I would just say that certainly I know, and I would say I can't even articulate clearly for you all the ways in which my religion shapes my worldview and my life, any more than I could, again, with my relationship with my wife. I've really tried to leave all religious argument out of it.
You have, that's why I brought it up.
Yeah, and I think
With
that's...
the elephant in the room.
Right, I think I'm really grateful to be a Catholic, because I think out of all Christian groups, we're the best at doing that. We're the best at trying to approach people who don't share our beliefs from something that we hope will be a common basis, and that's what I've tried to do tonight. And then thirdly, I would just return to what John and I just said, that what we have to do in this, as in all rational ventures, is try to examine the evidence on its own merits.
For Dr. Corvino, it's no secret that the official position of the Catholic Church is in opposition to gay marriage. If you could know that that was true, that God exists, and that is part of his will, how would that change your argument?
Well, look, if God says X follows, right? I mean, if we're thinking that God is an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God, then that would be the truth. And at least in terms of my own views and my own practice, I would know that it was the wrong thing to do, given that presupposition, which I find absolutely false. But then we also have to ask, in a society where we embrace freedom of religion, where just because I somehow have this revelation that the tenets of Roman Catholicism are true, not everybody has that revelation. What do we do? How do we live together in that society? And I would still believe, I hope, that religion is not something that we ought to force people to, even if we believe we have the truth, because a lot of people have believed they have the truth and they can't all be right. And that our views on marriage need to be based on an argument that is in principle accessible to all people of different faiths and no faith at all. And that's going to be based, again, on all kinds of data, including, and again, this is one of our big differences, the kind of empirical data about people's lives and relationships and what actually causes their well-being in society that I want to include and I think John Mark wants to exclude. So that's where I would be if that were the case.
And one more point of privilege for the moderator. Gentlemen, each please take 30 seconds to wrap things up from your own perspective. There will be no rebuttal. John Mark will open with you.
Oh, man. John said we wouldn't be doing this, so I didn't prepare anything. That's all right. I would like to close by saying, just to reiterate something I've said before, I don't want to say that there's not profound love between two people of the same sex. I don't want to say that some of that love isn't present, even in the midst of actions that I think are immoral. I want to say that I do think there's an incredibly important place for testimony, even for statistics, for medical evaluations, for all kinds of things, the sort of things that I haven't seen John bring up in other cases, which again gives me some sort of encouragement that I've done my job here tonight, and maybe you'll all be privileged to go where two people get up and discuss those things, the testimonies, the personal stories, the statistics. But I do think those have a place. I don't think that place is here tonight. Tonight, I think, is about understanding has clearly, I don't think we should call abstract, I don't think we should try to disparage clear thought, accessible to everyone, by calling it abstract. And I'm grateful that we've had an opportunity to do that. I'm very, very grateful for the chance to have met and gotten to know John Corvino and to share this stage with him. I'm very grateful to all of you for coming. Thanks so much.
30 seconds, Mr. Corvino.
Well, I too want to express my gratitude to John Mark Miravalle, and I also want to make it clear that, believe me, as a philosophy professor, I have nothing against abstract argumentation. In fact, some people would say I do it to a fault. But I do think that our arguments also need to be informed by real-world data. I mean, it would be like, if we're going to talk about a life as being unhealthy, we're talking about relationships as being unhealthy, without looking at that experience, without looking at that data, I think our arguments are very much incomplete. It would be kind of arguing against smoking without looking at the data on the effects of smoking in people's lives. I think that what we've been calling John Mark's abstract argument fails on its own merits because it involves the non sequitur between the premise that male and female are complementary sexually, and this conclusion that therefore that is the only legitimate function of sex, and even more important than the conclusion that it is the only legitimate function of marriage. I think when we look to our society and our government and the reasons we support the institution of marriage, they are much deeper and more varied than that, and I think same-sex couples can achieve those functions. And once again, I want to thank both the School of Faith and the Kansas City Atheist Coalition for setting this up, and I say I look forward to further dialogue. Thanks.